This video is brought to you by Blinkist. The first 100 people to go to Blinkist.com/geographics will get 1 week to try it out for free. You'll also get 25% off the cost of full membership. More on them in just a bit. On the south coast of China sits a collection of islands whose microscopic size belies their importance. Hong Kong, in its entirety, covers a mere 1,106 square kilometers, an area so small you could almost fit it inside Rhode Island 3 times. Consisting of 261 scattered islands, plus the Kowloon Peninsula and new territories, it seems like a geographic afterthought, a broken fragment of land snapped off from China proper. Yet the reality couldn't be more different. For nearly 2 centuries, Hong Kong has perched atop a geopolitical fault line, one which even today threatens to split wide open. Taken by the British at the end of the First Opium War, HK spent decades as a backwater colony before transforming itself into a financial colossus. A constant sticking point in Anglo-Chinese relations, it was finally handed back to Beijing at the end of the 20th century, only for its citizens to find themselves slowly sinking into an anti-democratic nightmare. But how did we get here? What tortured route did history take to leave Hong Kong so divided? Today, we're going to uncover the truth about the city struggling to balance between the West and the East. For most 19th century dudes, the first they ever heard of Hong Kong was likely in 1842, when the territory was handed to the British at the end of the First Opium War. At the time, the region was so empty it barely even qualified as the Sticks. There were about 20 villages, each with a handful of inhabitants. Indeed, Queen Victoria wrote after learning of Britain's new prize, "Albert is so amused at my having got the island of Hong Kong." But while the modern history of Hong Kong begins with the Nanking Treaty, it's not the only starting point. Prior to it becoming a pawn between 2 empires, Hong Kong already had a turbulent and exciting past. Although there is evidence of ancient settlement, the first definitive knowledge we have of people in Hong Kong comes from 25 AD. That's because the Eastern Han Empire stationed troops there, suggesting the region was inhabited. But there's a world of difference between inhabited and inhabitable, and on the latter point, Hong Kong Island, the focal point of the modern territory of Hong Kong, fell spectacularly short. The soil was bad, freshwater scarce, the terrain all annoying and mountainous. Perhaps it's no surprise then that neither the Eastern Han nor their successors did much with the land. Right through to the 2nd millennium AD, Hong Kong was inhabited mainly by a handful of fishermen and pirates who made their living attacking boats on the nearby Pearl River. When history finally did catch up with the island, though, it really caught up. In 1259 AD, the Mongols under Kublai Khan launched a vicious assault on Song Dynasty China. As the hordes swallowed more and more territory, people fled wherever they could. It was during this period of violence that the first ancestors of today's Hong Kongers arrived. Known as Bunday or Punti, these Cantonese speakers remained one of the territory's 4 traditional peoples. They were the guys who built Hong Kong's walled villages, who founded the 5 clans that would grow to dominate the area. They're also the guys who are thought to have pushed the indigenous inhabitants, today known as the tanka, off the land and made them go live in boats, a practice still part of their culture. But while the first Hong Kongers may have been fleeing the Mongols, they'd never escaped them. In 1276, the last Song emperor, a boy of just 9, was smuggled to Hong Kong for his safety. Not long after, he was killed during an epic naval battle on the Pearl River. When the waters at last settled, the Mongols were now in charge of China. But not for long. The Mongols were super quickly replaced by the Ming Dynasty, who the Punti down in Hong Kong adored almost as much as your kid sister adores BTS. And just like with your kid sister, it was a very one-sided crush. While Ming stability helped Hong Kong's population grow substantially for the first time in history, the Ming always considered those living there to be little more than evil magicians. Yet it would be defending the Ming that these evil magicians experienced their first great tragedy. In 1644, the Ming were overthrown by the Qing Dynasty. Fed up with all these hardcore Ming loyalists on the south coast, the new emperors decided to crack down hard. In 1661, the Great Clearance saw the whole of Hong Kong and the surrounding areas depopulated. Entire villages were relocated by force, cut off from their livelihoods. Coastal homes were destroyed. To return to the sea meant to be put to death. Although the laws were annulled 2 decades later, the damage had been done. It would take Hong Kong generations to return to the population levels it had seen under the Ming. By the time the island recovered, it would already be firmly in the sights of another empire. The seismic effects of the Great Clearance reverberated throughout Hong Kong's 18th century. Most obviously, they were felt in the arrival of the Hakka class, internal Chinese migrants who came to help HK rebuild and soon became the dominant ethnic group. But they were also felt in crazier ways, such as the founding of the Triads, nowadays a fierce set of criminal gangs, but back then a secret society of Ming loyalists. Yet, it was what was happening on the nearby Pearl River that would have the biggest impact on Hong Kong's fate. Way back in 1557, the Portuguese had set up shop in Macau, just 45 kilometers across the waters. It had been the start of an explosion in trade between China and Europe. Before long, all of the great maritime powers were racing to get a toehold in the Middle Kingdom. The greatest of all arrived in 1685. That was the year Britain's East India Company sailed its first boats up the Pearl River. Now, despite the British Empire's reputation as a stone-cold conquering machine, London didn't just immediately raise a flag over Hong Kong and declare it property of the king. In fact, the first 70 years passed without incident. The British established a base in nearby Canton, today called Guangzhou, and set about buying whatever Chinese goods were available. But then came 1757, and everything started going to hell. 1757 was the year the emperor brought in the Canton system to deal with all those pesky foreigners. In a nutshell, the system banned Europeans from entering China or learning the language and made it so they could only trade with a narrow, trusted elite. This was a disaster for Britain. Because the Qing refused British products, accepting only silver in return for Chinese tea and porcelain, a massive trade imbalance soon emerged, one that was depleting London's silver reserves. Worried by this sudden loss of precious metals, Britain desperately scrabbled to find a product the Chinese would buy, one that would allow them to claw back some of that silver. The product they settled on? Well, you probably guessed that it was opium. By the late 18th century, the British Empire had the poppy fields and the gung-ho attitude to both produce and smuggle opium into China on a massive scale. By 1839, the imbalance had completely reversed. Opium alone was paying for all of Britain's trade with China, and the silver was flowing back into London's coffers. Although the emperor had banned the drug as early as 1799, it had done no good. Millions were addicted. It was at this point that the Qing made a decision that would transform Hong Kong's fate. That June 1839, an imperial force surrounded the British garrison in Canton, seized all the opium, and destroyed it. But instead of being all like, this is exactly what we're going to do to Afghan opium in like 160 years, talk about historical irony, the British instead saw a golden opportunity, one that would force China to open itself up to free trade. In November 1839, Britain and China went to war. Known as the First Opium War, the fight was spectacularly one-sided. The Royal Navy rode up and down the Chinese coast, bombarding settlements, sinking Qing ships, and taking port cities at will. Canton was snatched. Shanghai, Nanjing threatened. By 1842, the emperor was ready to give the British anything they wanted. And what the Brits wanted was to humiliate the Qing. Known today as the first of the unequal treaties, the agreement that ended the Opium War saw many Chinese ports forcibly open to free trade, and the British given carte blanche to keep selling hard drugs. For our story, though, the most significant clause was one handing Britain a base off the Chinese coast. The Nanking Treaty signed Hong Kong Island over to the British in perpetuity. While we open this video saying how tickled Queen Victoria was to learn of her apparently useless new possession, the island did have one thing to recommend it: a deep, sheltered harbour known as Hyun Guang. On June 26, 1843, Britain formally took possession of the fragrant harbour, installing Sir Henry Pottinger as the colony's first governor. It would be more than a century and a half before China had sovereignty over the island again. Now, if you don't want it to be a century before you read your next book, well, you've got to check out today's sponsor, Blinkist. If you're like me, you're already looking around the corner to summer, please come. Daydreaming about what books you're going to read outside this upcoming outdoor season. Unfortunately, there's always way more interesting books than there are vacation days. There's never enough time in your busy schedule to read everything you're interested in. Fortunately, I have Blinkist. It's an app that offers easily digestible 15-minute summaries of all the best nonfiction books. There's more than 3,000 of them, and you can either read or listen to them. Personally, I listen pretty much all the time. It's sort of just like a podcast. It's just easier to fit into a day that way while doing mindless things like walking to work, cleaning the kitchen, folding the laundry, yada yada yada. 14 million active users are currently using Blinkist to get the best insights and need-to-know info from thousands of books. From self-help to business to health, whatever you're into, it's on there. For example, on my Blinkist list for 2021, I had How Luck Happens by Janice Kaplan and Barnaby Marsh, which I've actually now checked off my reading list. It's a whole book on how to create luck for yourself, which is fantastic, and it's distilled down to 13 minutes, which is even more fantastic. So if you're interested in learning big ideas in small packages, head to Blinkist.com/geographics, where the first 100 people will get 1 week to try Blinkist for free. You'll also get 25% off if you want the full membership. Again, 7-day trial, cancel at any time at Blinkist.com/geographics. In its early days as a British colony, Hong Kong was a miserable place to be. The shoreline was little more than a motley collection of opium dens and brothels, while outbreaks of the Black Death had a nasty habit of killing off visitors. The 100 years after the war is still known in Beijing as the Century of Humiliation, and with good reason. Flooded with drugs and at the mercy of colonial powers, China had to then contend with the Taiping Rebellion, a homegrown civil war that killed an incredible 20 million people. Insanely deadly conflict was still unfolding. The British and French decided to spark off the Second Opium War in 1856, plunging China into yet more chaos. At the end of this wholly unwanted sequel, Britain had torched the Imperial Summer Palace and added the Kowloon Peninsula to their HK territory. But the Brits weren't done adding to their property portfolio just yet. In 1895, just 30 years after suppressing the bloody Taiping Rebellion, China went toe-to-toe with Japan in the First Sino-Japanese War and lost big time. Although Britain hadn't been involved, the post-war truce so hobbled the Qing that they could no longer defend their borders. So when China sent word that they wanted more territory for Hong Kong, Beijing just meekly agreed. The request stemmed from a British worry about HK's inability to provide fresh water itself. While the colony had prospered as China slid into chaos, becoming a handsome port with a decent turnover of trade, it all meant nothing if a resurgent Qing army could one day just occupy the mountains towering over it and make everyone die of thirst. Bearing this in mind, the British negotiators went in determined to drive a hard bargain. They walked away with the keys to the kingdom. Handed over in June of 1898, the new territories increased Hong Kong's size by a whopping 90%. Along with 235 islands seemingly just thrown in like extras at a bargain sale, the new, much larger Hong Kong suddenly found itself home to nearly 300,000 inhabitants. For the Brits, this was all gravy. They now controlled not just a foothold at the edge of China, but the colonial equivalent of a luxury penthouse. But things weren't quite as easy as they seemed. Unlike the Opium War treaties, the Second Convention of Peking came with a sting in its tail, a tiny clause that would provide the basis for Hong Kong's tortured future. The new territories would be British property for only 99 years. For the 1898 negotiators, 1997 must have seemed impossibly distant, a year so far away it wasn't worth worrying about. You can almost hear them declaring, "By Jove, that's ages away. I mean, it's not like China's going to be some massive nuclear power we couldn't possibly win a war against by then. What? To be fair to those long-dead, very posh boys, though, China in this time seemed on a permanent downward trend. In 1911, the Chinese Revolution overthrew the Qing dynasty, unleashing a period of chaos known as the Warlord Era. While one of the main revolutionaries, Sun Yat-sen, had come of age in Hong Kong, it wasn't recognition the revolt bestowed on the port, but waves of refugees. All through the Warlord Era, Hong Kong's population grew and grew until it was bursting at the seams. Although not on a level with Shanghai or Singapore, Hong Kong was still bustling enough to absorb most of these newcomers, to even turn them into an asset. But there was no way the colony was going to be able to absorb what came next. 4,000 kilometers away, the sun was rising on a new and powerful empire. When it finally turned its attention on Hong Kong, it would very nearly be sunset for the colony. Although they'd fought 2 wars and forced through 3 treaties to procure it, when push came to shove, the British weren't all that interested in defending Hong Kong. After Japan invaded China in 1937, talks began in Whitehall about what to do if the Imperial Army marched on the colony. But rather than discuss defense, the British discussed how to make sure Hong Kong was returned to them after Japan was finally defeated. Still, if London saw HK as just a piece of land to be negotiated over, the same can't be said for those actually living there. By December of 1941, a Japanese attack was clearly clearly imminent. Since the Second Sino-Japanese War kicked off, the colony's population had ballooned by 800,000 to around 1.6 million. Over 250,000 refugees were sleeping in the streets. With China in chaos, supplies had been cut off, and there were severe shortages of everything from food to medical equipment. Foreign residents were being evacuated, while all remaining citizens were preparing for the fight of their lives. The attack finally began on December the 8th. That day, Imperial Army planes bombed the airport. By December the 12th, the new territories had been overrun. Kowloon fell shortly after. As Japanese bombers rained down death on Hong Kong Island, an envoy visited Governor Sir Mark Atchison Young to advise him to surrender. He was sent away with the declaration, "Hong Kong declines absolutely to enter into negotiations for the surrender," ringing in his ears. But Governor Young was just delaying the inevitable. On December the 18th, Imperial troops landed on the island. Ordered to take no prisoners, they unleashed a reign of terror. Surrendering soldiers were tied together and bayoneted to death. Red Cross workers were executed. In St. Stephen's College Hospital, 60 patients were murdered in their beds. Out in the streets, random massacres of Chinese civilians were carried out. Hong Kong formally surrendered on Christmas Day of 1941. It was the beginning of the 3 years and 8 months, a period of occupation that was brutal, even by Japanese standards. In those dark days, over 10,000 Hong Kongers were executed for trivial offences. The Chinese and English languages were banned and a strict curfew was brought in. Alongside random massacres, there were reports of endemic sexual assault by Imperial troops. Over the next few years, up to 1 million Hong Kongers fled, many winding up as refugees in neutral Macau. By 1945, a combination of Japanese mismanagement and Allied attacks had left a quarter of the colony in ruins. Luckily, the 3 years and 8 months was now almost over. On August the 15th, with Nagasaki and Hiroshima reduced to glowing piles of rubble, Emperor Hirohito broadcast his message of surrender. At the end of the month, British troops returned to Hong Kong. It had taken the best part of 4 years and many thousands of lives, but London had succeeded in its goal of keeping Hong Kong after the war's end. But while the war was over for Hong Kong, the fighting was only just getting started in China. From pretty much the moment the last Japanese troops left, mainland China was consumed in a civil war between its communist and nationalist factions. For Hong Kong, this meant another wave of refugees seeking to escape the violence. This time, though, as the war turned definitively in the communists' favour, many of those fleeing into Hong Kong came not just carrying money, but big ideas. At last, on the 1st of October 1949, Chairman Mao proclaimed victory in China. It was the start of a brand new era in global politics, one that witnessed the dawn of a communist superpower in East Asia. It was also the beginning of Hong Kong's transformation into a serious global player. After Mao took power on the mainland, pretty much everyone assumed his next step would be to snatch Hong Kong. In this post-war world, London was badly weakened, Hong Kong was far away, and the Chinese Red Army was big enough to simply sweep down and occupy the colony by force. But rather than attack Hong Kong, Mao decided his first foreign adventure would be on another peninsula, Korea. And that was a bad move. China's entry into the Korean War was what made the USA suddenly get very jittery about Mao's plans for East Asia. Whereas Beijing in late 1949 probably could have taken both Hong Kong and Taiwan without many consequences beyond international hand-wringing, by 1950, any more aggressive moves could have sparked a brand new Pacific War. The UN slammed a trade embargo down on China. But while this may have deterred Beijing from attacking Hong Kong, it also meant Hong Kong could no longer legally trade with its largest market. The result was a great, miserable sump that unfolded across the 1950s. While families in America were enjoying a prosperous decade, people in Hong Kong were wondering if there was any future for them at all. Had they been told just how wealthy the colony's future was destined to be, they probably wouldn't have believed it. The changes began before the decade was out. All those wealthy Chinese who'd fled communist rule, well, they weren't content to just be poor refugees in a poor colony. They started investing, building new local industries like textiles. Before long, they'd ushered in an economic boom. Now, before you start applauding these guys, just know that this boom was only possible thanks to some serious exploitation. The poorer refugees working in these factories were treated so badly that it became an international scandal. People were forced to work 16-hour days for laughable wages. Child labor was common, and industrial accidents removed fingers and eyes at a stupefying rate. Even as Hong Kong surged into its economic miracle of the 1960s, the awful working conditions threatened to destabilize it completely. There were strikes, demonstrations, social unrest. In 1967, spurred on by extremists inspired by China's Cultural Revolution, this unrest soon turned into riots, arson attacks, and even bombings. The only reason Hong Kong didn't implode is because the colonial government blinked first and passed sweeping laws designed to calm things down. This meant new laws against exploitation, massive public works to generate employment, building vast social housing so that to this day about a third of Hong Kongers still call it home. With the era of exploitation ending, the situation calmed. Although the colony would undergo a devastating stock market crash in 1973, it was now on a firm enough footing to survive the shock. Investments in new industries like electronics brought in money, as did the end of the Cultural Revolution and the rise of Deng Xiaoping, who brought in an open-door policy between Hong Kong and China. Suddenly, this small British colony was one of the few gateways businesses had to the vast Chinese market. The economic boom that followed made many people very rich. However, it also highlighted a looming problem. It was just now 2 decades until Britain's lease of the new territories expired. While the unequal treaties had granted Hong Kong Island and Kowloon to London in perpetuity, nearly half of the colony's population now lived in the new territories, and everything was so integrated that slicing it in half would cause chaos. It dawned on London that there was only one way to solve this problem: either give nothing back to China and risk a major war, or give back everything. One of the strangest things about the decision to return Hong Kong to China was the lack of say Hong Kongers were given in it. In some ways, this wasn't surprising. Hong Kong had never been a democracy. In the entire time the British ran it, they did so at the behest of London and local business interests. It wasn't until 1991 that any elected members were introduced to the 60-person Legislative Council, or LegCo for short, and then there were only 18 of them. Still, the lack of any referendum or even consultation with the public did piss a lot of people off. Here were London and Beijing deciding the fates of 5.5 million Hong Kongers without, actually asking them about it. There was a lot of anger that Britain didn't offer a right of abode in the UK to their Hong Kong subjects, as had happened in earlier waves of decolonisation. Like it or not, Hong Kongers were going to have to deal with becoming Chinese citizens. The treaty for returning Hong Kong to China was inked on December 19th, 1984. Perhaps aware of how much they'd shafted the locals, the British tried to get some last-minute changes through that would preserve Hong Kong's freedoms. The Basic Law, or a kind of mini-constitution, was promulgated in 1990. It guaranteed freedom of movement, of assembly, of speech, and of the press. It preserved the common law origins of Hong Kong's legal system and enshrined things like the right to political dissent. China, in turn, agreed to honour the Basic Law for 50 years, running Hong Kong under its one country, two systems policy. One also applied to Macau. But here's the thing about treaties and constitutions. They're just words on paper. And words aren't worth anything if you don't have the ability to back them up with action. The colonial era in Hong Kong finally drew to a close at midnight on July 1st, 1997. The day before, there were celebrations attended by luminaries like Prince Charles, Chinese Premier Jiang Zemin, and former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. After the Union Jack lowered for the final time, the last British governor, Chris Patten, made a speech, marking the end of over a century and a half of history. And then the sun set, the party started, and Hong Kong again became a part of China. Were we making this video 3 years ago, this probably would have been a nice place to stop, with the colonial era coming to an end. Sure, we might have included a couple of sentences on Hong Kong's growth as a financial centre in the early 21st century, maybe even included a brief reference to the 2014 umbrella protests. Then it would have been, thanks for watching, smash that like button, yada yada yada. But we're not making this video 3 years ago, at a time when it seemed that China was still abiding by the letter of its agreements, if not the spirit. No, we're making it post-2019, in an era when we've watched the one country, two systems policy implode and massive protests get crushed under Beijing's boot. And that means this video doesn't really have a happy ending. Starting in the summer of 2019, protests against a bill allowing extradition to the mainland turned into a democratic uprising in Hong Kong. Beijing's subsequent crackdown was broadcast around the world. You're probably familiar with the images of riot police charging protesters, of university buildings under siege, of tear gas and stun grenades and injured teenagers. The worst part of it? It was all for nothing. In 2020, Beijing passed a new national security law which superseded the Basic Law and cancelled most of Hong Kong's freedoms. This was followed in 2021 with a Patriots Law that stops anyone not firmly pro-Beijing from taking any seat in the LegCo. Hong Kong may have never had any real democracy, but now it no longer even has the window dressing of it. The story of Hong Kong, then, is still being written. No longer in London or even on the streets of Hong Kong itself, but in Beijing backrooms by apparatchiks determined to end the region's special status. Perhaps that's the tragedy of Hong Kong's history, that this unique place, created from the wrangling of great powers, never got the chance to determine its own fate, to carve out its own place in the world. We can only hope the future holds better news, however unlikely that may sadly be. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks to today's sponsor, Blinkist. And another thing, if you're interested in subjects centered on East Asia or even specifically China, you should check out another channel I run called Mega Projects. We make 3 videos a week on that channel on giant engineering projects, world wonders, mankind's greatest achievements, that sort of thing. We've got a fair amount of content on China and a lot of the really impressive infrastructure projects that they have, so give it a look. There is a link in the description below. And as always, thank you for watching.